Hey, you lovely lot, and welcome back to Crime Analyst and the Intelligence Cell. And today I want to talk to you about a really important case, and it's the case of Joanna Simpson. And you may not have heard about this case because when Jo was killed in 2010, there wasn't much media about what happened to Jo. And the media that there was about her case really did frame the person who killed her in a positive light because he was a British Airways pilot, and that seemed to carry a lot of weight and also favour and credibility in court. And I want to tell you about what happened to Jo. I want to tell you about the relationship with Robert Brown, and I want to tell you about what happened and when she tried to separate, and about this High Court battle that Brown put her through for 3 years. And I want to tell you about her children and the investigation when Brown decided to kill her. And then I want to tell you about the trial of what happened at court, because it's so egregious what happened to Joanna Simpson. And I want to be her voice today, and I want you all to hear what happened, and for us to understand what a gross miscarriage of justice the case is. Well, you can decide for yourself, actually, but I hope that you will be galvanised into action after I've explained what happened to Jo. But before I get into all of that, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for subscribing to my new Crime Analyst YouTube channel. This is very new for me, and I really appreciate your support. I also appreciate your comments. Thank you for engaging and messaging me. You know, this really is an important platform for me, and I really want to bring key stories that matter to you. So it's not just about storytelling, it's also about how we understand violence and abuse and those who commit the violence and abuse, and what we can do to stop it, and what we can do to be the voice of someone if they've had their voice taken away. And that's what we need to do with Jo's case. And I hope you'll join me in the campaign that we launched today called #NotAnotherJo. So before I get into the case, if you haven't subscribed to Crime Analyst, please do hit the subscribe button now so you don't miss out on future content. Also, just to give you a trigger warning, the content is upsetting and distressing. Unfortunately, murder is a horrible business, and so is domestic terrorism, which is all what this case is about. So firstly, I want to tell you about Jo. Joanna Simpson was a vibrant, energetic, positive person who went to university. In fact, she went to the same university as me. We're both alumni of the same university, so I feel like there's a form of affinity with her. And when I talked to her mother, Diana Parks, and I've interviewed Di extensively, and her best friend, Hetty Barkworth-Nanton, and you can listen to my interview on Crime Analyst on the podcast, and you can hear everything about the incredible Jo. And in fact, I've done 4 episodes on the case because it means so much to me to platform Jo and her mother and her best friend and what happened. So you can listen on the Crime Analyst podcast. It's episodes, let me just check and get this right, 105, 107, 110 and 111. And 111 is really a tribute to Jo, to correct the narrative of who she was. And that was really important to me, to Diana, to Hetty, because at her trial, it was almost like Jo was put on trial. There was a character assassination, and that should not have been allowed. So part of what I'm doing in the storytelling and talking with you now is to correct the narrative. As many of you know my work, that's part of what I do. Centre the victim, make sure they're not footnotes in their own case, identify what went on, identify prevention points, and also how we can intervene and prevent in other cases, but also spotlight things if they go horribly wrong. When we need law change or something to happen, well, then I launch campaigns. And in fact, I've changed 9 laws already to better protect victims. And this is my next campaign, working with Diana, working with Hetty and many other people to call upon Dominic Raab, the Justice Minister, to review this case and make sure Robert Brown does not come out of prison, which may well happen in November, because he will have served his 13-year sentence. Okay, 13 years, some of you are already reeling, thinking 13 years for killing Joe? Well, I want to tell you about what happened and how it happened, and then you can make your own determination of what and whether this is justice, or whether you believe, like me, this is a miscarriage of justice and we have to use our voice and take action. Okay, so I've already mentioned about Jo and being such a vibrant personality, very popular, much loved. She was very bright at university, and she also turned her hand. She set up a bed and breakfast. Now, these were before Airbnbs, but she made her home a hospitable guest house to people, and people loved staying with Jo. And she won awards, actually, for doing her bed and breakfast. So that tells you the type of person that she could turn her hand to things, and people loved being around her. She loved throwing dinner parties. She loved cooking. She loved gardening. She was a homebody. She loved being a mum. And she wanted to be a mum. And she met Brown later on in life. So she was thinking about children. And that does happen. Well, Brown to her presented as someone quite different. He presented as a British Airways pilot, and that does play in this case. The air of credibility, plausibility, a good job. Yeah, a good person is what we might think. We trust a pilot when we're on a plane, giving us in their dulcet tones reassurance about the weather or the flight plan or the flight path. We put our life in a pilot's hands, effectively. And I want you to think about that and what role that might play. But Jo thought he was someone credible, a good man, charming. And it was said that he was dangerously charming and also controlling. So let's think about that, attentiveness versus control, because I will talk about risk and risk factors. I just spent the last 2 mornings getting up at 5 a.m. to teach people about high risk factors and high risk clusters with the DASH, the Domestic Abuse and Stalking and Harassment and Honour-Based Violence Risk Model, a tool I created for police and all partner agencies so that if someone like Jo discloses, we ask the right questions, that we're curious and we trust our instincts and we keep asking questions. But that didn't happen for Jo. And I always want to make sure the legacy is that the tool is used and the right questions are asked and the answers given are understood. Because Jo being killed was a continuum of the coercive control and stalking that she was subjected to by Brown. But when she married him, he wasn't that guy. He was attentive, he was romantic versus controlling. There can be a fine line. But when she married him, the ring went on the finger and he was someone quite different. And he was insulting towards her, commenting on her appearance, putting her down, this chipping away at self-confidence. Now, the psychological abuse and the emotional abuse, well, it's actually more than that, because he was trying to control her movements. And Di, her mother, listened to Di talk on Crime Analyst, the podcast, said that he wouldn't make an effort. He'd come home from a long-haul flight, he'd just check out. If Di was there, he wouldn't make an effort. These things are important, right, in giving us an understanding of the relationship. But Jo wanted it to work, and particularly when she got pregnant, because she was thinking about leaving and then she fell pregnant and she was torn because she was desperate to be a mum, and she decided to make it work for the sake of the children. And so she stayed. And in fact, she had 2 children with him, Alex and Katie. Now, she stayed in the relationship and she tried to manage Brown, but it was too much. In 2007, he threatened her with a knife. She knew she had to leave for her safety and the sake of the children. She was terrorised by him. He would turn up at the house, he would watch her through the windows, he would break into the house using the burglar alarm code that he had managed to cajole out of the children. And this coercive control and stalking behaviour wasn't recognised as being coercive control and stalking, and it wasn't put before the court, more importantly, at the trial, when Brown went on trial for killing Jo. That's a huge error, and I'm going to come back to that. I said I'd talk about the trial specifically, and I will. But Jo did leave him, she did separate, and separation is a high risk factor. It's not when things get better, it's normally when there's coercive control and stalking, it's when it gets worse, and that's what happened for Jo. It got worse, it escalated. Separation, 76% of murders happen on separation, when someone tries to regain control and when they have the mindset, I will win at all costs, and it ends when I say it will. And that was Brown's psychopathology. And I've seen this so many times with coercive controllers, I will win at all costs. And that's what he attempted to do. He took Jo to court through the High Court. He wanted money from her because she was financially well off. He wanted, as he called it, parity, even though they had a prenup. And when he realised that he most likely wouldn't win the High Court battle and that she would divorce him, I believe it's then that he started to think about murder and killing Joe. And it was a premeditated act. Well, you think about the facts and I'll tell you that the flight path that Brown took was over Windsor Great Park, the Queen's estate. And it was there that he dug a grave to specifications, and it took weeks, if not months, to do so. And imagine, in October, the ground is hard, and he would take the children to play there in a den whilst he was most likely digging this grave. He had bought a crate and lined it to a specification. On October the 31st, when he took the children back to Tun Cottage to Joe's on Halloween, he took with him a forensic suit. He had a tarp that he used. He took a claw hammer, but he smuggled that into the children's backpack. And when the children were in the cottage, he took that claw hammer out and he bludgeoned Joe to death. He struck her 14 times. He brutally killed her. And as I said, he was wearing this forensic suit. He then loaded her body up into the car using a tarp. The children heard what he did. They were ear witnesses, but they also saw him load her body into the car. And then he put them in the car. And they were terrified. They asked if he would take their mummy to hospital. But he drove them to his girlfriend's house, Stephanie's house. She was pregnant at the time. And yes, perpetrators may well have new relationships. My question is, how did he treat Stephanie in that relationship and that child? We know pregnancy is a high risk factor to serious harm and femicide when there's a coercive controller. And the children stayed with Stephanie whilst he went off and buried Joe in that grave, in that plastic-lined crate. And then he came back to the house and Stephanie said that he couldn't fly because he was so exhausted. He was going to get on a flight and take passengers on a long-haul trip. What we now know is that he did call the police, a 999 call, where he asked very coolly and calmly for an appointment.
Hello, Thames Valley Police, Nicole speaking.
Yeah, hello. I'd like to make an appointment to come in regarding an incident that occurred yesterday.
Okay. Can I ask what the incident was?
It's of a domestic issue.
Right, okay. So you wanted to make an appointment to speak to someone about it?
Yes.
Okay. Let me take some details from you. The reason I'm asking for that before I can make the appointment is because it is a domestic in our policy.
Well, I mean, it's a serious domestic, if you want.
Yeah. Okay. Usually with our domestic policies, what we do is we advise that we losses to 10 within the hour. But if you want to make an appointment instead of that, I can still do that with you.
Say it again?
Our policy for domestic incidents is usually for an officer to attend within the hour to discuss this.
Yeah.
Okay, but if you're not able to do that, I can still make an appointment with you.
I mean, I'd rather come up to the police station as I've got 4 children here, and I wouldn't want to.
That's fine. That's not a problem.
To worry them any further.
Okay.
I mean, I won't. You know.
Yeah. Okay.
He didn't say that he had killed Joe. He didn't say that help was required. He just said he needed an appointment. 5 minutes he was on that call. He wanted to meet with officers, and he did. And then officers interviewed him, Thames Valley police officers, and 5 days later, on November the 5th, he took them to the grave where he had buried Joe on the Queen's estate at Great Windsor Park, and they found Joe's body. He was charged with murder. However, what happened at court, because you might think that this is a slam dunk case, and as I always say, there is no such thing, because what happened at court was that Robert Brown did give evidence, and he assassinated Joe's character. He made her out to be a cruel and mean and vicious woman, and it went unchallenged. The coercive control and the stalking was not put before the court. He claimed that he had an adjustment disorder, and that wasn't challenged. And when the family spoke to Mr. Graham Reed's QC about that and said, please challenge what he's saying about Joe, it's not true. And please talk about the coercive control and what was happening at the High Court and stalking, and that they had evidence that what he was saying was not true. Mr. Reed's turned round and said, that's trivia, trivia, trivia. I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I'm here to get a murder conviction. I am absolutely appalled that that was how Di and her family were treated. Di's daughter was brutally killed, and that's how she was talked to. The fact that it went unchallenged meant that his narrative went uncontested, And that hung heavily on the jury, along with the fact that he was a British Airways pilot. And I was told by Hetty, if he could have worn his uniform, he would have. That played in at the trial. So it was so important to challenge and contest. Equally with this adjustment disorder, that went unchallenged. What, he suddenly gets this adjustment disorder as a British Airways pilot? Don't you think that somebody would have picked that up in his day-to-day? The job that he's doing is so important. People put their lives in his hands, and BA didn't pick that up. And if this disorder was real, at what point did he have it? And it's temporary as well, by the way. This isn't something that remains with you. It seems terribly convenient he had this adjustment disorder, but yet his behaviour and his actions betray him. It was a cool, calm, premeditated, most likely over weeks, if not months, because he knew that he would not win the High Court battle. And that's the finality point on separation. He knew he wouldn't win. That was the thing that he needed to achieve, was to win at all costs. And that was missed by the prosecution. And that should have been put before the court. And because it wasn't challenged, what then happened was the jury returned guilty manslaughter conviction. Now, what that effectively meant was a lesser sentence. Of course, if you're sentenced to murder, the judge can give a longer sentence. But in this case, the judge sentenced manslaughter, which is 26 years. However, Brown is due to come out after 13 years of serving half the sentence. And that will be November. And the family are terrified. Joe was terrorised and terrified by Brown, and now Di and Joe's brother and the children are terrified of him coming out. And this just cannot be. This is an insult, the fact he served just 13 years for brutally killing Joe in such a premeditated and calculated way, with the children present, should tell you everything. They should be aggravating features. This should have been a murder conviction. And he must serve the full sentence. Why is that important? Well, it's important because Joe could be any one of us, right? It's also important because if he is allowed to come out in November, he's still a risk, right? He was diagnosed as being a psychopath at court, and I believe that he is. And there's no cure, there's no treatment for psychopaths. And what about this adjustment disorder? Has that been reassessed? What about the next woman who he has a relationship with? She's at risk. He's a serial perpetrator. We know that. There were other women that he abused. Okay, the serial perpetrator, I want those individuals to be on the same register as a violent and sexual offenders register, and Brown is a contender, but he should not be coming out for another 13 years. We want to ensure that Dominic Raab, the Justice Minister, uses all his powers to review Joanna Simpson's case and Robert Brown's release to ensure that this early release is stopped. Now, he does have the power to do this. What I will tell you is that under Section 132 of the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act 2022, he can prevent the early release of Brown, and he must. But it takes all of our voices to ensure there's enough pressure that he makes the right decision and uses that clause to ensure that he doesn't come out. You see, the other problem with probation is that we've already seen many failures, and I've talked about the failure of Jordan McSweeney coming out, and the fact that there were 69 offences and that he was released as a medium risk offender when he was high risk. But there have been other cases, Terry Harris, Janet Scott and Pearl Black. The probation service have been decimated. They cannot possibly monitor Brown 24/7. That puts the children at risk, who are now adults. That puts Di at risk, Joe's brother, and that puts future women at risk. So we're asking for the right thing to be done, that he is not released, and that this is used in other cases too, right? Joe is really important in this, but Di and her family recognise that there are other cases too. So the hashtag that you can use if you do tweet or use social media to talk about the case and support the campaign is hashtag #NotAnotherJoe. And you can write to your MP if you're in the UK. And the Joanna Simpson Foundation have put together a template where you can go on their website, use that template, write why this case is important to you. And I would suggest that Joe could be any one of us, and that this sentence is an insult to Joe, to her family, and to all women. So please do the right thing, take action. So I've told you the case of what happened to Joe. I talked about her in my training today, because when I teach and train professionals, I use the real cases that I advocate on. And I am part of this campaign, having recently won the campaign for dangerous domestic abusers to be included on the Violent and Sexual Offenders Register. And we won that campaign after 22 years, and it was announced on Monday, the 20th of February. And I never give up. because we all can play our role in advocating when someone no longer has their voice to talk for themselves. So I hope all you lovely lot take action. You'll see some of the information in the show notes. Listen to the interview on Crime Analyst, the podcast, 4 episodes. Please subscribe to Crime Analyst if you haven't already. And most importantly, take good care of yourselves. Until next time, be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instincts.